Welcome, Kiora. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Lincoln University. Welcome to Be Lincoln Innovation. Today, we're going to talk about the future of pet food. But before we start, we will let all the participants come into the webinar and find their space. For those of you who are just joining, you are joining the B-Link webinar talking about the future of pet food. And I will let everybody settle in before we start. I still see people coming in. Kia ora, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Lincoln University. Welcome to B-Link Innovation. We are going to talk about the future of pet food today. And I think, am I going to get a thumbs up from Katie? I'm getting a thumbs up from Katie, so that means we're going to start. So now, probably for you who have been here for a long time, you probably hear this for the second time. Kia ora, and welcome to Lincoln University B-Link Innovation. My name is Wim de Koning, and today I'm very proud to introduce to you one of our Vibe events, talking about the future of pet food. Before I go into introducing our speaker of today, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping and explain to you a little bit about B-Link Innovation. So today's webinar is brought to you by B-Link Innovation. We are a full business unit of Lincoln University, and we are seen as the innovation hub here at Lincoln University in Canterbury, New Zealand. We believe that innovation starts by just connecting people, just by bringing people into a room and they actually start to talk to each other. And when they talk to each other and discover that they share passion, then suddenly collaboration is definitely on the horizon. And we truly believe that if parties put passion into collaboration, innovation is inevitable. So that's what we believe in, and that's what we do. A little bit of housekeeping for this webinar. This webinar is recorded and will be emailed to you. You as participants, you are muted. There is a possibility to interact with our speaker by using the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you move your mouse around, you see this ribbon with Q&A. You actually can put your questions in there, and we'll make sure that by the end of this session, Jono, our fantastic speaker, will actually be able to answer them. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to Jono Cox from King Country Pet Food. He has a lot of experience in pet food, and we were just before we started, we were just talking. Both Jono and myself, at one moment in our careers, worked for a company called Mars. But I was on the chocolate side and he was on the pet food side. So yeah, and you could probably see about our gray hairs that has been a long time ago. So Jono is really an expert in pet food and anything related with pet food. So I'm really happy that he will actually share his experience about the future of pet food. And I will stop sharing and give the floor to you. Thank you very much, Jono.
Thanks, Wim. And I think obviously what we can see here is that if you work in the chocolate side of Mars, you just get grey hair. If you work in the pet food side of Mars, the hair just actually seems to disappear. I think is the main thing that we can take out of that. Let me just see. Let's make sure that that's all coming up all right. Wim, can you just confirm for me that you're seeing that screen has come up?
Yes, I'm seeing your presentation. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. It's actually really cool. And we were just actually talking before, and I got shared the other day the list of participants today. And I think what's actually quite cool is it's a really wide range of people. It was cool to see people from the universities there, from government there, from the pet food industry there, and also, the edible sector as well. So, it's actually quite cool to be getting this group together. based off that, and I'll talk a little bit more in a second about how I'll sort of structure the presentation today, but I have tried to make this a little bit of a pet food 101. So I hope the people in the pet food industry aren't too disappointed. Obviously, I'll be very much focused on trying to get people who aren't in it just a bit of background about what we're all about. But feel free that when we get to the end of the presentation, you can always ask me any curly questions, which I can then try and dodge. So to getting into it, what I'll try and do today is I'll quickly just go over my background, just extending on from what Wim's just taking you through then. I'll give you a quick thing then, also the abridged history of pet food. So how have we got to where we are today? I want to talk about who are the key players, both globally here and in New Zealand. Sorry, globally and here in New Zealand. Global markets, who are the big movers and shakers, and there probably won't be too many surprises there. Really want to then get into the trends. I think, when I've asked people coming into the presentation, the things that people were most interested in, it was what are the trends that we are seeing? And then I want to try and cap that off a little bit and sort of say, well, where am I then seeing, personally at least, in my humble view, the opportunities and challenges for New Zealand? So my background in a very quick nutshell, I think I'm a good Canterbury boy. I grew up here. I did my study at Canterbury University. I often say I learned how to make petrol and aluminium and spray-dried dairy powder and things like that. Saw a job advertisement that said graduate process engineer and decided that sounded like a bit of me. And next thing I knew, I was working for one of the largest food companies in the world, being Mars. Now, as Wim says, Mars is a company made up of a lot of different segments. I'd just like to point out at this point that it's still true today. Pet food is actually the biggest segment within the Mars company. I worked there for about 10 years, and I quickly learned actually that I really enjoyed the process of product development in particular. So most of my time there was spent in innovation roles. I also spent a little bit of time through there as well in quality assurance and also operations for my sins. About 2010, I decided it was time to move the family back to Christchurch. Timing's everything. I think that was August 2010. We came back down here to start a R&D management role at Hellers. I think many of us would know what then happened in September 2010, so that was an interesting time period to be making a move. But stayed there for 3 years, learned a lot about small goods, so a little bit different, but also got exposure to a whole lot of different processing technologies, though wouldn't have otherwise. Came across to Ansco Foods, again, initially doing edible product innovation, but saw some real opportunities to really go back to my roots of pet food. And really for about the second half of the 7 years that I was there, was doing work where I actually set up a joint venture with Ziwi, who's a company I'll talk about a little bit later, where we actually set up an air-dried pet food plant that's still running today out in Burnham. Finished with Ansco in 2020, and you can see a theme here. I seem to love finishing up with businesses at times of turmoil. So I finished up at the start of 2020 and started consulting and then went straight into COVID lockdown. Started working for King Country Pet Food as a consultant in the middle of COVID lockdown, and then by later that year evolved into a full-time role. And I've been in sales and technical roles at King Country Pet Food ever since, and I'm currently their head of R&D quality and compliance. And very, very briefly, this is King Country Pet Food. It's a factory that's in the process of commissioning at the moment. It's in Taumarunui, up in the middle of the North Island, so it's a town of 4,000 people with what should be pretty much the largest pet food processing plant in New Zealand, with a possible output of around 30 to 40,000 metric tons a year of dry kibble pet food. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity for that small town. I won't get too detailed in this. I've often been told I could probably spend a whole half hour talking about the evolution of cats and dogs and what that means and some of the science behind it. I find it pretty interesting, but I won't bore you all with that. I think, as most people know, dogs have, evolved from wolves over time, and interestingly enough, they started their relationship with humans about 15,000 years ago. They tended to scavenge around human settlements, and when we started to domesticate them, we were feeding them the byproducts of our own agriculture. And where that becomes interesting and pertinent is that what we're seeing is that recent studies are actually showing that domestic dog breeds have really shown clear genetic changes over time through artificial selection. understandably, the dog breeds that have actually done the best are the ones that have been able to make the most off all of those different co-product streams, which understandably involves things like vegetables and other starch sources. And that means that, while possibly your traditional wolf, obviously, is a reasonably traditional carnivore, that's certainly shifted over time. And I would say that that's a somewhat controversial view, but I think the science backs that up. Cats, on the other hand, again, they've been around for quite a long time. Their relationship with humans probably started about 9,500 years ago. But I think, as any cat owner would testify, they've shown a lot less domestication or shift in their genetics from their wild cat ancestors. We've often used them for vermin control. So, interestingly enough, then a core part of their diet, particularly up until fairly recently, has still remained reasonably similar to what they may have had in the wild. And that's possibly the reasons why we're not seeing that there's such a big shift there. And the end impact of that is, as I say, you could probably consider cats as true carnivores. Dogs, there's an argument there that they are moving more towards being somewhat omnivorous. And as I say, I could probably talk the rest of the presentation about this topic, but I think I would lose half of you by the end of it. But if anyone out there is still arguing their dog is a wolf, I'll present Exhibit A. Whoops, if it'll go on. Oh, no. I lost it. Hang on 1 second. Apologies, guys. I'll bring it back. I think I pressed the wrong button. Here we go. Hopefully that's now back up. Wim, can you confirm you've actually got that back up again now?
Yes, but you have not. You're not in presentation mode at the moment.
Thank you. There we go. I'll bring it back to that slide. Apologies, I think I pushed the wrong button. What I was just about to say was, if anyone here is arguing that their dog is still a wolf, then I'd like to present evidence. This was photos I took last year at a trade show in Las Vegas. And for those who are questioning, these are both real dogs. That is not a stuffed toy in the backpack on the left. But it's also actually evidence of something we'll talk a bit about later, is that there's a real trend towards humanization of companion animals over time as well. So I guess in an evolutionary context, commercial pet food it's a reasonably recent development. The first commercially prepared pet foods generally believed to be a biscuit product that was developed by James Spratt at around 1860 in the UK. It was a product formulated from wheat, vegetables, and blood. I actually found it quite interesting when I pulled this presentation together that actually way back when there was also still some quite interesting references to wolf dogs as well. So that whole concept of wolf diet's not that new. The first wet canned pet food then made an appearance in 1920, and there's the Kennel ration, which was actually made from horse meat. It was produced by the Chappell brothers in the US. And again, what was interesting about that time as well is when we start to see some of the first pet food specific regulation being developed. And it was being developed by the American Association of Feed Control Officials, who in the industry we'd know to be AFCO, who set nutritional requirements that most of us tend to follow. Following that, in the 1950s, we started to see Ralston Purina, General Mills starting to produce what is now the most commonly fed format in the world, which is extruded kibble. We then now look at sort of the last 30 years or so. How has that then developed? Wet pet foods actually evolved, particularly looking into single serve offerings, things like pouches and trays. The other interesting thing then when we look at the last 30 years or so was actually how much New Zealand as a market's actually really been at the leading edge of some of these innovative formats. And the first one's a funny one because we look at chilled, and I think most of us look at old dog rolls, and dog rolls has actually been around for quite a while now in New Zealand. I think that superior dog roll started in the 50s or 60s. And because of that, most of us in New Zealand see chilled as a pretty bare basic, product to be feeding your animal. Whereas, interestingly enough, and we'll talk about it more later, is if we look at some of these other markets, particularly the United States, chilled is really seen as a very premium format. Another two formats which have really made themselves known as sort of an evolution, if you like, of dry pet food has been the creation of formats that use very, very high levels of fresh meat. And Ziwi were really probably some of the pioneers here looking at air-dried pet food. And as you see on the front of pack there, talking about being 96% fresh meat, and also Canine Natural as being a real pioneer in the area of freeze-dried pet food as well. Both those formats now are very common out in the market, and we see a range of factories around the world doing air-dried and freeze-dried, but realistically, some of the very first pioneering work in those areas happened here in New Zealand. This is a slightly old slide, but still tells a story about, where some of the key global players sit. We've talked about Mars, but also between Mars and, interestingly enough, Nestle, and you see the call back to Purina that we had on the previous slide there as well. Between Mars and Nestle, we're basically talking about half of the commercially prepared pet food that's sold in the world. Add to that Colgate-Palmolive, who have some of the Hills diet underneath it, which might be another 8 or 10%. J.M. Smuckers, which we don't know as well here in New Zealand, but a significant brand, particularly in the US. And we've probably easily got around 60 or so % of the global market just being shown here in one slide in 4 separate companies. So from that perspective, it's a consolidated market, but there is a massive amount of brands underneath that. Though what tends to happen over time is significant brands get built and then they end up being purchased by one of these larger players. New Zealand, as I feel, has really punched about its weight over time. I've talked about Ziwi and Canine Natural as being real pioneers in this area, and I think the rest of us have got a lot to thank them for really doing the hard yards of really selling the concept of New Zealand provenance and all it means when it comes to pet food. And both of those companies have grown incredibly well over the last 15, 20 years. There's a range of other products that come out of New Zealand and brands, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list. That's just some of the first ones I managed to find as I was pulling together the slide. A couple that I'll just pull out in particular is, interesting enough, the Chef and Champ, and I think most of us New Zealanders would know Cats Prefer Chef from many, many years ago. Those are products that are actually made by Heinz Watties. And at least the last time I checked, New Zealand was, I believe, the only place in the world that Heinz Watties was actually manufacturing pet food, and only for that New Zealand market as well. Global markets, probably no big surprises here. And this is out of a recent Coriolis report. New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, very established markets growing steadily, and all markets where New Zealand provenant products have done well. The game in town, I think, for all of us has absolutely been China. And I think where that's most interesting, and I don't have the numbers on this slide here, but if I went back 7 years ago and looked at exports out of New Zealand for pet food to China, China was almost non-existent, and the US had almost continuously been the biggest market for New Zealand provenance pet food. As of last year, China had seen the exponential growth that you're seeing here and had overtaken the US market as being our single largest country or customer country for pet food out of New Zealand. We then look at our global pet food market, look at sort of the size by segment. I really know probably big surprises in play here. We look at dog food. It's the biggest part of the market because dogs eat the most. Again, no surprises, and no surprises that cat is number 2. Interesting one, probably just to keep an eye out in here, is the other. And it was probably just something I was looking for. I was in China with one of my colleagues about 3 weeks ago, and it was interesting, certainly hearing the stories of people starting to look at other smaller companion animals like rabbits, which makes a lot of sense, obviously, if you're in a very small apartment in the middle of Shanghai or something like that. So I think that could be an interesting emerging market and could be somewhere where there's actually some room for innovation. I've always got to the point that I hate the word humanization, and I'm going to talk about key trends, but I probably, in the 25 years I've been in and around the pet food industry, I probably can't think of a presentation that's talked about marketing or the general pet food industry that hasn't used the word humanization. I think the reality is, and humanization, I should say, is literally just the fact that people, generally speaking, are starting to see their dogs and their cats as more than just the dog or cat. They are companions, they're part of the family, and in some cases, they're effectively seen the same way as they may, for example, see their son or daughter. And that's seen in a lot of different ways, but I think the reality becomes that, in my view, humanization isn't a trend anymore. It's just the way things are. if you care about things for yourself, then they're probably likely to be things that you care about for your animal as well. But if I look at some of the extreme examples, this photo again from just a couple of weeks ago. This was a pet store. I'm pretty sure it was in Shanghai as well. And not only did they have a special room where you could bring in your cat or your dog and give them a birthday, and I'm still not entirely sure whether it was meant to be with their friends or your friends, so lots of other dogs or lots of other people. But they had people on site that would specifically make a birthday cake for your cat or dog as well for them to enjoy as part of the event. So interesting times. But I think what humanization really means is these next trends that I'm going to be talking about. And I think the first one here is the one that I think most of us understand really well. And I think it is still a really core opportunity for us as New Zealand. So functional ingredients is looking at, well, what are the specific, particularly health claims that we can actually be looking to make for our products? And these 5 are just 5 examples. They're probably the 5 that customers are probably caring about the most at the moment as a general rule. The only one I probably haven't mentioned on here might be dental. That being said, they're also very, very common out in market. So there's an interesting point there about to how much these things are actually going to give you a point of difference in market. But if I look at skin and coat, that could be adding in things like omega-3s, omega-6s, adding micronutrients like zinc or manganese, or specifically just adding other foods. And I gave an example of salmon here, for example, where you're effectively adding those other things in that natural ingredient state. Digestive health is an incredibly important one. And I'd say actually important for both cats and dogs, but particularly for dogs. And one of the first things on there is insoluble fiber. And that's primarily there to actually try and give good stool quality. Again, you'll be happy to note that I haven't decided to actually share the stool quality chart in this presentation. But I think any of you who own a dog would appreciate that having a good poo quality is actually reasonably important and a pretty big part of that product development. So there's that consideration. Then we also start to look at prebiotics, probiotics, and now also postbiotics as well as starting to emerge. Prebiotics being products like chicory annuline, which are effectively looking to provide soluble fiber that will help to feed microorganisms in the hindgut, seeding the product with true probiotics, so live bacteria, to actually try and establish good colonies of the right bacteria in that hindgut. Or finally, again, the interesting one just starting to evolve now is postbiotics, so trying to look at the compounds that might be being created by those good bacteria, and a postbiotic is theoretically trying to deliver those compounds directly. And there's actually some quite interesting science in behind that from a cattle feed perspective, and I think it's still being established for companion animals. Joint health, clearly, again, whether that's adding supplementation of things like chondroitin or glucosamine, or adding in natural products, again, like green lip mussel. I think green lip mussel is a bit of a victim of its own success. It's great product. It's incredibly well known out in the industry, but I'd also say that if you walk around a pet specialty store in the US, then you'll find it in probably half the products around the place. And the reality is that anybody can buy New Zealand green lip mussels as they are in their native state, ship them anywhere around the world, and incorporate them into a product. So an interesting challenge is about how do we take some next steps there. Immune function is definitely there. Again, that could just be simply supplementing with things like vitamin C, or maybe making natural antioxidant claims linked to, for example, here, blueberries. And finally, here, heart health, which is normally just linked up to the fact that we would look to, particularly for cats, look at adding taurine in there, and that's a basic nutritional requirement for that animal anyway. Raw in this process is a really big trend, and again, probably linked into the fact that people are seeing it as incredibly important for them. So probably linking right back to these trends like paleo, etc. So at its extreme, it's products like the raw product I've got up here on the left-hand side, or the top left, which is actually looking at that's just frozen meat patties, so with no processing whatsoever. They've had their own challenges, and in any given year, particularly in the US at the moment, there's significant recalls that are happening for products like that because of detections around pathogens like salmonella and listeria. I mentioned chilled before, and again, this is an example over in the US. So again, from our perspective, just a basic dog roll product, but over there, a really premium product going into that chilled segment. And I should say as well, starting to see some more interesting, or at least from my perspective, interesting pack formats actually start to establish themselves in that chilled format too. Fresh pressed is an interesting concept and starting to gain a lot of traction. That's effectively using, rather than what we traditionally do, which is use time and temperature to effectively be looking at rendering a product safe and destroying pathogens, using high pressure processing instead to deliver that. And that's certainly gaining a lot of popularity in that freeze-dried space to actually allow them to make raw claims. And then finally, what we're also then tending to happen is to see hybrids of these kind of products. And the example at the bottom here, or bottom right, is a product which is a kibble pet food still at its heart, but has actually had a small level of coating of a raw, likely high-pressure processed freeze-dried product that still allows for some pretty big, impressive claims actually going on to that pack, but at a much tighter price point than probably the product above it. Now, the trend here, we're seeing a bit of a shift away from grain-free. Grain-free is something that probably started to evolve back in the 2000s. I would have said it's probably been linked back to when gluten-free and things like that started to become popular. And the history there is interesting because about 3 or 4, maybe 4 years ago now, there were some significant issues reported in the US around issues with heart health in dogs. In fact, in particular, a number of dogs were reporting issues with a disease called dilated cardiomyopathy, or DCM. And at that point, the FDA actually went as far as to say that that could be linked to grain-free pet foods. Now, I think Time's probably said that there may or may not have been an issue there, and there probably definitely wasn't any really good, strong evidence that suggested grain-free diets had any specific linkage up to those health issues. The jury's still a little bit out there. But what it probably did say as well is go, well, there may be nothing wrong with grain-free, but what was right about it in the start anyway? And in all honesty, there wasn't a lot there. And people are now starting to come back and say, okay, well, there's actually opportunities for putting grains into pet foods. And in particular, you're seeing things like here, ancient grains, wholesome grains, and you start to see claims around things like quinoa and buckwheat and things like that. Human grade is a claim that I hate with a passion, and I'll try and get this over and done with quite quickly. But it's a very strongly growing piece of the market, particularly in the US. And it's interesting because obviously I'm looking at probably purely at a technical level and going, this product is in no way better or worse for your animal than a product that maybe had been using other co-products. I feel like where the pet food industry has actually done really well and over time is actually we have been making the most of co-products from the food industry and making good sustainable use of those to make really good nutritious products. And what products like this effectively do is actually put us back in competition with the edible market. So in a world where we're saying we have a limited amount of protein, that fundamentally doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I've clearly coming into this absolutely no bias, but if you do want to spend a whole lot more money on a product that's got no value for your animal, then this is a good way to go. I won't talk about sustainability much because it's exactly the same things you see in the edible market. Opportunities around packaging, whether it be recyclable, compostable, etc. Opportunities around ingredients, so sustainable sourcing of seafood or whatever it may happen to be. Opportunities about looking at the broader carbon or water, etc., the general footprint or environmental footprint or paw print of the product obviously is areas which have got a lot of interest. This then links into meat alternatives. I was talking to Wim really quickly before this around insect protein. I really love this brand, and maybe I'm just of that age that the concept of Jimny's actually, or Jimny cricket actually sort of resonates with me. But this one obviously using cricket-based protein as its basis, Probably the most common protein we're seeing out in the market today would be black soldier fly larvae, still very much an emerging part of the market, but does seem to be growing, and very much a premium offering as well, I should say. And to be honest, when it comes to vegetable or plant-based proteins, pet food's always looked at using plant-based proteins, so we've actually been fairly well ahead of the curve there. But we are now starting to see as well those products, similar again to human food, looking at using all plant-based materials as well. Treats, again, showing some great growth, and certainly growth above and beyond the market as people want to engage more with their animals, want to, reward them either for good behavior, or possibly, particularly in the case of dogs, giving them something to occupy them. And it's come from quite basic and humble beginnings, like the old dogs go wacko for schmackos ads, which some of you might remember, through to the more natural products that we're seeing today, which might be just air-dried animal pieces, or freeze-dried as well, is quite common in the space as well. Personalized nutrition is a really interesting space and very much on the cutting edge right now. There's some really interesting work happening where people are actually taking, obviously doing DNA testing of animals, and then coming back with recommendations as to what would be the best food for your specific animal. I'd say at the moment it's really just starting out and probably reasonably generic. So I'd say it's very much still a case of, say in the case of these guys, they would get that DNA test and then they'll be saying, yep, you should be using this product off our current range. I actually feel like there's a really interesting opportunity here for someone to really try and derive specific things from that DNA profiling. So maybe your animal is going to have a specific higher risk of a specific health condition in the future, and then looking at really true personalized nutrition for that animal. And that's not without its operational challenges, but I think it could be a really interesting opportunity moving forward. Finally, and apologies, I've been going at a rate of knots because I want to make sure that I can get through these and get through to hopefully a few good questions. Affordable nutrition kind of is going to overarch all of this. We understand the changes in the global economy, or even just our local economy. And I don't think it changes then the wants that people are going to have for their animals. People still want all those things. The amount that we care for our animals hasn't changed. The reality is that, our purses are probably tighter than they were 24 months ago. So I think there's going to be that ongoing focus now. And hopefully what it actually means is that people will ask a few more questions, and may at times there's, as an industry, we're certainly not immune to a bit of fluffy marketing now and again. So hopefully you can get people asking questions and going, okay, what's a really great product for my animal, but is giving me value for money? It's not, doesn't have to be the cheapest by any stretch, but it's about that value for money proposition. So we start to talk about now, well, what do we think that actually all means at the end of all that? And it's probably the most important part of all of this. I guess we have great quality ingredients. There's no doubt about it. Again, guys like Ziwi, Canine, and even then more broadly in the New Zealand food industry, particularly the meat industry, has done some great works to sell the concept of clean, green New Zealand, pasture, free range, and all the rest of it. I think that gives us a great ticket for entry. I think the opportunity, as we talked about, is, how do we actually look at those functional claims from those ingredients? How do we actually really understand, more than just saying, okay, I've put some salmon into this. What have we done to that salmon? Have we processed it in a different way? And how does that mean, and I only take salmon as an example, how does that mean that you're going to have a better outcome for your animal? And the good news is we've got some great expertise in that area in New Zealand, because we've built it up over time, certainly from a food processing standpoint. We've got capabilities all around New Zealand, whether it be at Lincoln or Otago or Massey or Auckland, through the Food Innovation Network. We've got some great capabilities in that space. And the great thing as well, and this is actually somewhat unique, is we also have some great capabilities in the area of pet nutrition, through the CRIs at Ag Research, but particularly I would do a shout out to my old mate at Massey University. So I don't know if my supervisor is present. Hopefully he's being nice to me if he is. But we have some great pet nutrition capabilities sitting there for really understanding what works for cats and dogs. And we have some great capabilities sitting there in Palmerston North at Massey University. These all come with some big buts, unfortunately. I'd say I think we all know the clean green image has got its limits. And the problem becomes is that some of it's pretty superficial too. We know there's some concerns underneath that. Examples of that might be things like bobby calves, or might be, some of the bigger sustainable issues, nitrate runoffs, all the things that we know about. There's work that we've got to do there. If we really want to be selling our clean green image, then we've got to continually improve in that area there. There is backlash against globalism. And I guess what I mean by that is, as much as that New Zealand provenance has sold incredibly well into markets like the US and still into China, what we already see in the US market today is that obviously there's a credible patriotism there. And I would say, as a general rule of thumb, if they can make the same product over there and make it with a made in the USA claim, not only will it probably end up being cheaper to make over in the USA by the nature of their scale of agriculture, made in the USA will, and this is a generalization, but will be a stronger claim than made in New Zealand. If we look at then China, I think we've been sort of, from our perspective, fortunate enough that there's actually been some pretty active distrust within China as to some of the issues of quality of food in general and pet food that was possibly being made in that domestic market. I think China's actually done a lot of work to try and improve their regulations in that sort of space. And they're also currently doing a lot of work to really actively market to their populace and say, hey, there's real advantages to buying made in China. So that's going to be a consideration for us, I think, moving forward. And finally, I think, there's, as much as we absolutely need to make sure that if we're making claims on pack, that we've got good scientific basis for them, there is a downside there that, there can be some significant restrictions on those claims, and it can just make it that much harder to actually try and gain competitive advantage. So, in summary, I think the first thing I'd say is our understanding of pet food nutrition is in some respects very much in its infancy. And I guess you could probably make the same argument for human food nutrition. We're still sitting there. I think there's still some fairly basic things that we're, saturated fat's probably a great example in that space. I think we're still really trying to understand these things in practice. So it's a work in progress, but it's definitely happening. Pet food trends are definitely mirroring the things that we see in human foods. And, hopefully that, if anything, makes our life easier, but it's certainly a consideration. I mean, New Zealand's got great opportunities to leverage our agricultural sector. There's just no doubt about that. We're sitting there with ingredients that are the envy of the world. But again, I keep using these buts. It's a crowded and complicated market. And what we've now got to work out moving forward as a country is, how do we take next steps to really get sustainable competitive advantage? And I really do go now into the category of my opinion. And obviously, as a technical, sciencey person, I think all of the problems in the world will be solved by science. But I feel like that, yep, we need to use our trusted ingredients, but I feel like our opportunity is to understand them better than anybody. And particularly in that, I believe it's about how we understand those raw materials with respect to health outcomes and other outcomes for companion animals. I think that's an incredible opportunity. I think then as well, it's not going to be enough just to understand those ingredients, but it's how do we process them in a way that we optimize what can come from it? Because if we can't do something to them, then we won't have IP to protect. So how do we develop processing technologies that can actually then give us advantage and start to create the opportunities for intellectual property protection? And then finally, we've got to do the part that, as New Zealanders, we've always been the worst at. We've got to manage and actually protect that intellectual property. So I'm looking forward incredibly positive. I've been in this industry, as I say, for longer than I care to admit. it's a really fun place to work. Having worked in both the edible sectors and pet food sectors, I honestly believe it's more fun because how else do you manage to go into an office and get to play with dogs all day long or cats? And actually interesting as well, I think from a technical perspective, the additional challenges that come into actually making a nutritionally complete pet food actually make it a really satisfying place to work. But that is it from me. So I'd just like to say thank you for your time. Hopefully you managed to hear all that. I know I went at a bit of a rate of knots, but I was trying to make sure that I kept time and we had a chance for some questions. So thank you again.
Hey, Jonah, thank you so much. That was absolutely very enlightful. And yeah, I think more than just the pet food one-on-one. And so I think you sold yourself a little bit short there. Before we start with the questions of the people online, and that giving the people online a little bit of time to, if they haven't posed a question, to actually put it into the Q&A button under their screen, and we will actually come to that. A question from my side: how loyal are pet food buyers? So, in other words, if I get my first dog and I don't know, vet is recommending brand A, how easy or how difficult will I then go to brand B? Or will I always stick with brand A forever and ever and ever?
I think it's a good question. I think the general answer I'd give to that is that people will tend to be pretty brand loyal because it's if I particularly take the example of cats, cats are incredibly fussy, which I think everybody understands. I think I've lost most of my hair trying to work out how to get cats to eat different food. The reality is, once you've actually got a food that you know your animal eats, you're likely to stick with it. And to be honest, the same issue with dogs. If you've got an animal a food that you know for your dog is going to give you the result that you want, you might well change flavors within a range or whatever it is because you want to give that variety. But you're sort of sitting there going, I know that my animal is thriving on this. They've got good coat. Again, they may have good stool quality. They for cats, they're just eating it, which is a big thing by itself. And there's always that concern. I know as a cat owner, and it was really interesting as we went through all the COVID logistics challenges, and there were some real issues in that. Like at one stage for about, I think it was the better part of 6 months, we were out of stock for Whiskers on shelf, for example, which is a really core brand. And people were having to actually panic and really try all these different things. And all of a sudden you're trying one, oh gosh, it doesn't want to eat that. So all right, well, there's 3 kilos of dog food or cat food I'm never going to get back. And so you go and buy another one. So I think from that perspective, for purely practical reasons, people will tend to be reasonably loyal, and it's certainly not generally. And again, there'll be certain people that'll be all based on price, but it would be the lower, not as big a part of the sector.
Cool. Thank you so much. And indeed, we have some questions in the Q&A. Really good.
Cool.
We have an anonymous question here. Is there any growing trends in using or not using dairy or non-dairy products, bioactives in pet foods for those functional support properties that you mentioned earlier?
Sorry, so was the so just repeat that. So there's any opportunities?
Is there any growing trends in using or not using dairy ingredients / bioactives in pet food?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I actually came across this a couple of years ago. We were looking at the opportunity for using dairy protein in a product, and it's an interesting one insofar that it's not commonly used. And probably because of that, there's not a lot of good data on it. So we were kind of sitting there going, well, there's actually no good data saying we can't use it, but there wasn't a lot of good data saying that we could. So when we were trying to work out, like, were there issues with intolerance of it or things like that, obviously there's an understanding that particularly those older animals may tend to be sensitive to lactose and those kind of things. But to be honest, what killed that project in the end was just simply some of the cost of that protein at the time. So I think it's an option, but it would probably require a little bit of validation just to make sure that there weren't nutritional issues there. The other side of it is because it's not common in market, there'd have to be a bit of a test there from a marketing perspective as well to make sure people aren't going to go, what do you mean you're putting milk into my product?
Thank you so much. I have another question here. You talked about bobby calves or veal. Higher minerals from beef, higher vitamins from veal. Could that be a game changer? Any thoughts on that, Jono?
A game changer in terms of using veal because of higher vitamins and minerals, was it? Sorry?
Yes.
Look, I'm always open to opportunities there. If there was an opportunity to sell, I guess there's going to be two things at play there, right? I think we all understand that the concerns when it comes to bobby veal are more animal welfare, general public concerns, and obviously they'll be the first considerations and behind it all. I mean, the pet food industry uses a lot of veal today, so whether they be co-product, well, they're all co-products arguably, but whether it be meat or trim from it or the other components that will be coming from those animals. If we turned around and we suddenly said, well, actually there's a specific health benefit that came from using a component of bobby veal, then maybe, but there's again, same problem as almost last time. There's a bit of work there to validate it, and then you've got to consider how to market it.
Cool. Thank you, Jono. Ben asked a question, and he is basically seeing that there is a large loss of R&D facilities and in the pet food industry, and he is especially looking at Massey University due to budget constraints. Is there industry support on the horizon to keep these facilities open, or will these research facilities just disappear from our New Zealand shores?
What way's the wind blowing? I don't see them going anywhere, but there are pros and cons to all of them. I mean, I did talk about a number, and unfortunately, there is some challenges there with some of those facilities will allow you to run pet food trials, but only using edible grade ingredients, which can be a real constraint, though. Probably shouldn't quote me, but I'm pretty sure Massey University does actually allow you to actually use pet food grade ingredients as long as they've got it all separated and managed ahead of time. And I know they were actually growing some of their capabilities up in that space as well, particularly the dry pet food space. So I think broadly speaking, hopefully the capabilities are going to increase. But yeah, you're in a good space if you're talking to Massey and you're talking then, I think, through the Food Innovation Network and the Food Pilot up there, then if they can't help you, then I think they'll point you in the right directions to people who can.
Cool. Thank you very much. Biochar. Trevor Richards is basically saying biochar is being incorporated in commercial pet food products overseas, for example, Germany. Benefits could be odor, upstream and downstream, gut health, carbon footprint. Do you think pet food producers should be investigating in the potential of using biochar here in New Zealand?
Send me some information and I'll tell you.
Okay. Trevor, if you want to be in contact with Jono, you can either do that through B-Link or find Jono directly. He's there on LinkedIn, and you can probably find him via his company website as well.
Yep.
Dwayne is asking, from Ag Research, is asking a question: are there any areas of animal health benefits, dental, skin, etc., that are really technical, that are really technically hard to target?
Technically hard to target. I think the hard ones to target, I mean, a lot of the ones that I listed off are really popular because they're really important to customers, but to be honest, they're also generally fairly straightforward, at least to do quite basic claims on. I think the hard ones, and I think you're right. He's right to bring up around hard, because as much as that means there's development costs, there's also an opportunity for competitive advantage at the end. The hard ones are going to be, how do we prove some of the longer term health opportunities? I don't know. Good example it's probably going extreme, but how could you reduce the risk of, I don't know, cancer? Or how could, maybe a more realistic one, or actually one kind of which I'd be quite interested in as well, would be reducing the risk of diabetes, particularly in dogs, and would be quite an interesting one as well, because I think that'll come down to their abilities for digesting carbohydrates. I think it'll be looking, I think, at those more chronic conditions, I think, is actually where some of the interesting work could be. But again, I think anything that then lets you actually really make some claims on pack, which is actually strong and lets you actually say, rather than a lot of the claims on pack today, lets you just to say, help support immune health or whatever it is, which really means next to nothing in practice. Wouldn't it be great if I could be putting an ingredient in that says, this has been proven to boost your animal's immune system? So I think there's those opportunities too.
Okay, thank you. Colleen is asking if there's any New Zealand research available on dietary requirements for dogs.
Depends what you talk about, but certainly if you want to really get to the basics of dietary requirements for dogs, they're kind of defined by a couple of organizations globally. The one that's commonly used, and you'll see claimed on the back of most packs, I mentioned the American Association of Feed Control Officials, or AFCO. So that's AAFCO. And they define for both cats and for dogs at all their different life stages, all the vitamins and minerals that are actually going to be required for a complete and balanced diet. They're not the only ones. There's also an organization called FEDIAF in the EU, which does a similar kind of thing. And to be honest, there's a lot of commonalities between the two as well. So if you wanted to look at it from quite a scientific perspective and get down to the level of, this is the level of thiamine and this is the level of zinc or whatever it would have to be that's in there, then that's where we as an industry go to.
Thank you very much, Jono. There is a question here from somebody anonymous. How much raw product goes into making 1 kilo of extruded Kimble?
Short answer is that depends.
That's what I just made a bet with Katie, my colleague. I said, I bet you he's going to start with it depends.
That's right.
I won.
You called it. It. I mean, look, sorry, was it the level of fresh meat that goes into it, or the level of meat?
Raw product.
Raw product. Yeah. So again, it really does depend. I mean, if you go back, traditional old kibble, for example, can have no raw product going into it, can be reliant completely on pre-dried meat products actually going into it, in particular things like poultry and beef meals. At the other end of the spectrum, it can be well over half of the kibble product. So, and it comes down, obviously, those products are going to have different levels of cost. And interestingly enough, it's a very dangerous conversation to start me on, and my colleagues are on the call will know this. But I would just point it out that a higher level of fresh meat isn't necessarily better.
Yep. Lots of questions coming in. Yeah, Nina is asking, are there any functional ingredients that you see emerging in the market elsewhere in the world? Example, the green lip mussel, next to the green lip mussels.
Goodness.
Yeah, you are getting the hard questions, Jono.
I know, and that's. I think that might be Nina from Ag Research as well, is it? And okay. Is it? I don't know. She should.
Yeah. I just see her name. I don't see the organization where she's from.
All right. Oh, that's all right. Anyway, but that is a tough one, and I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I mean, you do see all sorts of weird and wonderful things. I think I saw something the other day which was marshmallow root, and then there's chamomile, and look, to be blunt, there's a lot of things that go in there that are I would call it fluffy marketing, and you do see that, and it's not hard to find that when you go out into the market and you see products out there, and you'll see that there's these little things at the very tail end of the ingredient list when you look on the back of the pack. In terms of answer the question, though, in terms of really novel things that are out there driving true functional claims, I'm drawing a blank right now. But if I think of anything, Nina, feel free to get in touch. I'll see if I can think.
I think she answered to me that she is definitely from Ag Research. So yeah, it is that, Nina. Hey, so talking about this, so we have unique resources here in New Zealand, right? The green lip mussels being one of them. Some forms of special Manuka Kanuka honey would be another one. Are those ingredients that you think, would you use them if they don't have a functionality in the food?
Look, again, cards face up. There are absolutely people out there who will will put, and I won't talk about specific examples, obviously. But there are. You don't have to look far, whether, to be honest, in edible food or pet food, to find people who are putting things in which are claims around ingredients that don't necessarily have functional benefits, but they're there because they sound nice. Green lip mussel, I'd say in particular, is a really good product. There's no doubt about that. And there's actually some really good science behind a lot of that. You do have to be a little bit careful because obviously, you'll have some products that have got quite a lot of it in there and other products that may not have a lot of it in there.
Flitter, yeah.
So always just have a look at the ingredient list on the back of the pack. That'll tell you a lot. Look, if I'm honest, Manuka honey for one's me. I like it's a cool ingredient, but I haven't as yet seen that there's a benefit there for cats or dogs.
So, in other words, the science for companion animals is lacking.
Yeah. And I kind of look at it when you're actually putting it into a processed pet food. I'm not 100% sure that you're going to see the benefits that you can have by actually having full-blown honey.
Yeah, and then it suddenly becomes a really expensive ingredient. Hey, we're coming to almost the end of the session. I see a lot of people disappearing as well, or some people are disappearing as well. So I want to end with a last question, I think, and I'm going to pick one. Is there a truth that a unique / novel protein is generally better for most dogs as opposed to a blend of co-products / proteins?
I think the only time I could say there is benefit there is if you've got a dog who might have some sort of intolerance or allergy. So, if you've had a dog that over its life has had lots of chicken and lots of lamb and lots of beef or whatever it might happen to be, and you've got an intolerance or something going on there, then obviously going to goat or venison or whatever it might happen to be could be a really good way of still getting good quality protein into their diet in a way that obviously is getting past that or around that intolerance. But I would say as a general rule of thumb, otherwise, I wouldn't personally see a benefit there.
Okay. Hey, Jono, thank you so much. This was really, really, really interesting. And we're getting nice comments as well on the chat for people saying thank you as well. So it wasn't only me that enjoyed this. And I think everybody online enjoyed this as well. So, Jono, thank you very, very much. And for giving us a view into the future of the pet food. For the people online, before we're going to close, we have some events coming up. We are talking about dairy, and actually, can we have plants growing it? We have Dr. Abby Thompson actually joining us here at Lincoln University. We do have an activator session again. So if you are thinking of starting up your own business, come our direction and we can actually help you with some good pointers. We're doing that in partnership with the Canterbury Employers Chamber of Commerce. We have Professor Amanda Black talking about genomes to the giants, and this is part of our excellence series. And then we have in the next 5 series, we have Assure Quality bringing us on a journey looking at quality assurance in the ag sector. So without any further ado, Thank you so much, Jono. Thank you so much, attendees, for being here. And I hope to see you soon. Kia ora. Thank you.